Okay, good morning everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the Foundation for inviting me here to speak today. This is my first time in Finland, it's my first time in this fantastic building, so I'm very pleased to be here to share some of my research with you. Now what I thought I'd do today, given I've got quite a long slot, is not just present one paper, but give you a broader overview of the research agenda I've been working on with my King's College London colleague, Dr Julian Limberg. I think that fits nicely with this event and also what you're hoping to achieve. And then, as we've already heard, towards the end of the presentation, I'll talk about some of the UK's recent experiences with taxing the rich. And hopefully there can be some lessons in there that can be useful for Finland and other countries looking to rebuild their public finances after the pandemic. Okay, so I thought I would start, given I'm coming to you as a British person to talk to you about tax policy for an entire hour, that really I have to start here. And this is really what not to do. And so for anyone who's not followed the sort of roller coaster of British politics in 2022, I'll just fill you in a little bit on what this picture represents. Okay, from some of the laughter when I put it up, some people are already aware of this, given it was sort of a fairly major fiscal and political disaster. So this is our former Prime Minister, Liz Truss, on the right-hand side. This is her then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, on the other side, Chancellor of the Exchequer being the UK Finance Minister. She became the Prime Minister, the leader of the centre-right Conservative Party in September last year. Shortly after that, Truss and Kwarteng introduced their mini-budget. And this mini-budget was a large package of essentially unfunded tax cuts. There was the abolition of our top marginal rate of income tax, the 45% rate. There was a reversal of the previous government's decision to increase corporation tax, and many other things. So this was seen as a kind of big giveaway to the rich, and it also came right in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So as you can imagine, this was a huge political disaster for this administration. It was also a large economic disaster because of the reaction we saw in financial markets. So in both currency markets, the pound plunged and government borrowing costs went up dramatically. And so what this culminated in is that Truss had to fire her long-term friend and political partner Kwarteng from being the Chancellor after a very short period of time. She then was forced into resigning herself after only 44 days in office as the Prime Minister. So she became the shortest serving Prime Minister in UK history. Now the reason I'm starting with this is because the sort of justification that they gave for the tax policies they were implementing was that these were going to spur growth and that growth was going to benefit the wider economy. This was all part of a wider plan to boost growth in the United Kingdom. Now some of the research I'm going to be showing today that's already been mentioned really tries to test this and I think puts to bed this myth of trickle-down economics, that if you cut taxes on the rich, you're going to benefit the broader economy. Okay, so just to give an overview then of what I'm going to be touching on in today's presentation, I'm going to start off with our paper on the economic consequences of major tax cuts for the rich. I'm sure this is how the Foundation heard about my work, given this caused quite a stir in the international media and on social media. So I want to start there, and this will probably be the longest section of the presentation. Next, I'm going to present some new work that Julian and I have been doing with Lucas Havert from the University of Zurich, which is really trying to probe some more of the mechanisms about what's linking top tax cuts to inequality. This is one of the first times I'm presenting this work, so I'll be very keen to hear any thoughts or feedback that you have. Next, we're going to change tact a little bit. The first two papers are really thinking about what the economic consequences are of cutting taxes on the rich. The next paper I'm going to present is one that looks more at the preferences for taxing the rich, and specifically the preferences for cutting or raising the top federal rate of income tax in the United States. That's joint work with our PhD from the department, Nina Weber. Then I'm going to try and pull out, given this is a more policy-focused audience, some of the policy implications that come out of these three pieces of work. I'm going to end the presentation then by talking a little bit about the UK experience of taxing the rich. So my colleagues at the LSE International Inequalities Institute have done a lot of work on the UK tax system, on looking at how we tax the rich in the UK and sort of some of the consequences of that. So I'm going to talk about their work and then try and bring it round to some of the lessons there that may be relevant for other countries. I'll just end later on with some concluding remarks. Okay, so a fair bit to get through. So I'll start off talking about the economic consequences of major tax cuts for the rich. So what really motivated us to start this work was that we've seen this real dramatic decline in taxes on the rich across the advanced democracies in the last 50 years, in particular from around 1980 onwards. So just as an example from some famous work by Sheeb and Stastavage on taxing the rich, average top marginal income tax rates in the advanced democracies, they're around 60% in 1980. They've fallen dramatically since then in almost all countries, and they're under 40% on average now. So a big reduction in taxes on labour income on higher income individuals. We've still got this debate, though, in the literature about what the economic consequences were of this really sweeping change in tax policy. Just to give you one example there, looking at the relationship between tax progressivity and economic growth. There's several prominent studies that have found that tax progressivity, often this is measured by top marginal income tax rates, isn't significantly associated with economic growth, going against some of the sort of trickle-down type arguments. But there are some notable exceptions, including this paper by Gemmell et al. From 2014, that do suggest high taxes on the rich slow down economic growth. So there's not a real firm consensus, particularly on this relationship between taxes on the rich and growth. So we are aiming to close that gap in knowledge with our paper, or at least make a major new contribution to it, by estimating the economic effects of all major tax cuts for the rich in 18 OECD countries over this 50-year period, running from 1965 through to 2015. Okay, we choose to focus on these major tax cuts for the rich because, as I'll show you with some of the measurements of tax on the rich that we have, the history of taxing on the rich in the past period is one of sort of these large, infrequent packages of tax cuts that really reduce taxes a lot on the rich. And so this was our motivation for focusing on these particular types of tax cuts. When I see economic effects, we're going to be looking at economic performance, things like growth and unemployment, but also the distributional effects. So we look at income inequality as well, which is certainly tied into the theme of this seminar. And this is clearly not purely an academic debate. This has important implications for tax policy making in the advanced democracies. It's also very contentious politically, and I can tell you that from some of the social media reaction we got to our paper, particularly from people in the United States. Okay, and neither is this trivial. This is a big, important issue, because over the last 50 years, we have seen substantial differences across administrations, across the political spectrum, in their tax policy on the rich, which has had significant distributive implications. Now, just to give you one example of that from the United States, this is Donald Trump in 2017. He's signing into force here the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and this was a package of tax cuts worth $1.5 trillion. And the Non-Partisan Tax Policy Center did an analysis of these tax cuts and saw that the majority of the benefit was going to the top 5% of the income distribution. Trump sold these to the US people, that they would be rocket fuel for the US economy. And the then Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, he said that these tax cuts are going to pay for themselves because of the effect they're going to have on growth in the economy. Okay, so this is one side of this argument. A strong proponent of cutting taxes on the rich. On the other side, we've got the current US President, Joe Biden. This is a photo from his recent State of the Union address, which was just earlier this month. And as part of that address, he reiterated his commitment to this billionaire minimum tax, which would put a minimum tax of 20% on all incomes over 100 million in the United States. And this is really aiming at the top 0.01% of the income distribution. So I'm showing this as just to put across the point that both in terms of ideology, in terms of actual policy implementation, there are still big differences today between left and right in how they approach taxing the rich. And part of that is based on what they believe about what the economic effects are, something we're going to get into now. So one of the issues we found when we looked at the existing literature, really in political economy and economics, about estimating the economic effects of taxes on the rich, was around measurement, was around how we really capture taxes on the rich. And the current literature, we felt, lacked a sort of comprehensive approach. The rich can certainly be taxed through many different channels, top personal income tax rates, corporation tax, inheritance tax, etc. And a lot of studies really focus on just using one of these different measures within their study. And there are many different indicators you can use. So you could look at actual tax rates that are on the books, or you could try and look at measures that take into account the tax base, that take into account the actual amount of tax that rich individuals are paying by looking at effective tax rates or revenue measures. Different papers use both different indicators and look at different taxes. We felt, though, that these taxes can often be used as substitutes for one another. So you could look to raise taxes on the rich by increasing inheritance tax. You could do it by increasing top marginal income tax rates, or vice versa. And so we felt if you focus on just one indicator or one tax, you could be missing something important in terms of changing the burden of taxation on the rich. So what we try to do is construct a new index that does take into account a lot of different taxes and indicators. And we do that through Bayesian latent variable modeling. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with latent variables, these are sort of variables that can't be observed, but they can be inferred from variables that are observed. And so we construct this measure, which is really just based on the sort of shared variance of commonly used indicators. And so you don't need to make any decisions as a researcher about, say, how to weight the different taxes. This is all taken care of by the modeling approach. And one of the big advantages here is that what you get out of it is a sort of index which is comparable across countries and over time, which is useful for the type of data analysis we're going to be doing in this paper. We've got 7 indicators that then feed into our latent variable measure. And to address some of what we see as the weaknesses in the measurement of taxes on the rich in previous studies, we cover taxes on a lot of different things. So top incomes, taxes on capital like corporation tax and dividends, taxes on assets including inheritance tax. And we look at the top statutory rates, those that affect the richest members of society, what tax rates are levied on them. We also look at some of these other measures which are aiming to include sort of the definition of the tax base, effective tax rates and tax revenues as a percentage of GDP. So for each of our 3 areas of taxation, we have at least one measure of rates and at least one measure of effective tax rates or revenues. So here is the data for our comprehensive measure of taxes on the rich. We constructed this measure for 18 OECD countries for this 50-year period from 1965 through to 2015. I think there are a few key takeaways from this figure. The first and most obvious one, in part was sort of motivating our study, is that in pretty much every country here you see large reductions in taxes on the rich since the 1980s. The only exception really is Switzerland down here in the bottom left-hand corner, but that's because Switzerland has very low taxes on the rich for the entire period. Second thing to point out, which I just found interesting, is that the Anglo-Saxon countries, UK, US, Canada, these countries are now often associated with lower taxes on the rich, had very high taxes on the rich in the first part of this period before they dropped dramatically in the 1980s. And the last thing to say, which is important for our study, is that changes in this index seem to correlate closely with what we know were packages of major reductions in taxes on the richest members of society. So an example would be if we look at the US data down here, we can see that we've got the first Reagan tax cut here, a big drop in the index, the second Reagan tax cut here in the mid-1980s, another big drop in the index, and so that sort of increases our confidence that we're picking up these big packages of tax cuts for the rich in our measure. So each individual country may be a little bit hard to see here. So for those of you wondering, this is the data for Finland from the indicator. And so it follows a pretty similar picture to the other countries. We see a reduction in taxes on the rich really coming in the 1980s and the early part of the 1990s. I looked into our underlying data to see what was kind of driving these changes. In the drop up here, this is really a big reduction in corporate income tax that takes place at this point, and most of the other large drops in the index are due to reductions in the top rate of personal income tax. Okay, so just to say, if you actually look at this in the context of the other countries, some of these falls are actually a little bit smaller than the other countries, but we still see the same pattern. A big drop in tax on the rich in Finland that took place in the latter part of the 1980s and the early 1990s. Also another smaller drop in the early 2000s. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is identifying some of these major tax cuts for the rich. And so how do we do this with the data that we have? We take advantage of our comprehensive measure. We take the first difference of that measure, so the year-on-year change in our measure. We then take the standard deviation of that set of numbers, which is a measure of its dispersion. And then we pick out all of those tax cuts that take place where the index falls over 2 standard deviations. So we choose 2 standard deviations because it's quite a large threshold. Our theoretical focus here is on major tax cuts for the rich, and so that's why we choose a high index. A high threshold. But also we've seen this type of threshold used in the empirical literature in macroeconomics, for example. And also in line with some of the literature exploring the effects of changes in taxes and spending, these large fiscal policy adjustments, and looking at their effect on economic outcomes. So we do have some precedent from the economics literature for using this type of threshold in our analysis. But of course, as reviewers and other people want to see, the results do hold up if we use other thresholds. So if we use 1 standard deviation, this picks up a lot more tax cuts. And so some of them are smaller than the ones that we study in the main analysis, but the results still hold. So this is the sort of binary variable, the 0-1 variable that's created when we do this approach for identifying tax cuts for the rich. We see years in which there are tax cuts for the rich, major tax cuts I should say, in red here, and the years where there are not major tax cuts for the rich in blue. So we can see just from the speckling of red across the figure that both in terms of across the time period and also across the countries in our sample, we do see these major tax cuts for the rich. We also see a bit of clustering here, so really the most major tax cuts for the rich take place in this period, which is kind of the second half of the 1980s and the early 1990s. If we pick out Finland specifically, we see that they only have 1 tax cut that gets over the threshold, which is the one in the mid-1980s. There are only 2 countries here down towards the bottom where we don't see a major tax cut for the rich in the period. Switzerland we've already covered in that they just have very low taxes on the rich for the entire period. France, they do see a drop in taxes on the rich over the period, similar to other countries, but it's just more gradual, so none of those drops get over the threshold that we use in this paper. So before I talk about the empirical strategy that we use in our paper, I'll just talk about some of the limitations of existing studies that motivate the approach that we took. So we saw that there were 3 main limitations on this literature looking at the relationship between taxes on the rich and economic outcomes. The first one is really that most studies look at single taxes and indicators. As we've already talked about, there are a lot of ways the rich can be taxed on their income, on their assets, on other things, and so you might be missing something if you're just looking at one indicator. This is a sort of common and difficult to get around problem when you're doing this type of large cross-country work, is that it's very difficult to make causal claims with that type of observational data. if we're using a kind of panel data approaches. And also the political science literature, and I sort of straddle political science and economics, tells us reverse causality might be an issue here, particularly when we're looking at the relationship between taxes on the rich and inequality. There's a lot of research on the US, for example, that shows that the wealthy business interests are able to shape public policy in their favor, including tax policy. And so we really do need to think if there's a way we can get closer to being able to make causal claims. And lastly, then, there are a handful of studies that look at specific tax reforms and their consequences, or maybe a small number of tax cuts across countries. But there's sort of external validity, what we can generalize, what we can say about tax policy in the OECD countries is constrained by the fact they're looking at so few tax cuts. So with a particular focus on addressing some of the weaknesses in sort of panel data studies, we use a new econometric technique that's combining difference in differences estimator with matching methods to get us closer to causal effects with the type of time series cross-sectional data that we have. This is a recent approach pioneered by some political scientists at Harvard, Imai et al. So there's a lot more information about the method in the paper if anyone's interested in digging a bit more into it, but I'll just give you some of the main intuition about what we're doing and about how this is perhaps different from other studies in this field. So what we're doing is trying to compare countries that undertook major tax cuts for the rich in a given year with those countries that didn't undertake tax cuts for the rich in the same time period. And we're repeating that for all of those major reforms that we saw. There were 30 country year observations with major tax cuts for the rich in the sample. But of course, if you do that, there may be differences between the countries that undertook tax cuts for the rich and those that didn't. And we take 2 steps to try and reduce those differences to make our treatment and control as similar as possible. The first is that we look at countries with similar pre-treatment treatment trajectories. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it means a similar path of tax cuts for the rich before the reform was actually implemented. So we look 5 years before and only compare those countries that had similar trajectories on tax cuts for the rich. We then use this form of matching on a set of covariates that are known from the previous literature to influence the economic outcomes we're looking at. We try to match close countries as closely as possible on those covariates as well. So all of this is trying to get us closer to our treatment and control being as similar as possible. Okay, so after that, we then calculate this difference in differences estimator for different lags and leads. We do 5 years before and 5 years after. The 5 years before can help us ascertain whether the parallel trends assumption holds, which is key for difference in difference estimators. And then the leads allow us to see how the effect develops over time, and we look up to 5 years after the reform. So we're getting a sort of short and a medium term effect of these changes. Okay, so before I dive into the results, I'll just briefly summarize the sort of data we're using here. So we've got this data set covering 18 OECD countries over this 50-year period. We've got our main independent variable, which is this binary indicator for tax cuts for the rich that I've already discussed. But what economic outcomes are we looking at? We look at 3 key outcomes in this paper. The first is our distributional outcome is income inequality. So we're looking at the top 1% pre-tax share of national income from the Piketty dataset, the World Inequality Database. So it's important to note this is pre-tax inequality. So the effects we find are not just a sort of mechanical effect of redistribution, but they're going to be on the market distribution of income. These measures are nice because they're comparable across countries. They're calculated from tax data and using a common methodology. They also pick up both capital and labour income, and so that reduces the chance that tax avoidance is driving our results, given they're 2 of the main channels of income for the rich. We then look at economic growth using a measure similar to previous literature in this field, which is the logged real GDP per capita. And we look at unemployment, the harmonised unemployment rates from the OECD. And I talked about matching on covariates. Well, these are some of the covariates that we match on in our analysis: capital account openness, trade openness, also some political variables like left vote share at the last election, and also some government expenditure and government debt variables. Okay, so let's come on to the main results for the paper quickly. So this is the results for the top 1% income share for our measure of inequality. The black line is showing the cumulative treatment effect over time, and the grey shaded area is showing 95% confidence intervals. So what do we see happening here in the post-treatment period is that inequality increases in the countries that implemented major tax cuts for the rich. And this effect grows over time, so it's around 0.7 percentage points by the time we get to 5 years after the reform. So just to put 0.7 percentage points into some context, this is the equivalent in the UK to the income share of the bottom 14% of the income distribution, and that's going to the rich every time there's a major tax cut for the rich. And so this is a rather large concentration of income in the hands of already very affluent households that take place as a result of this tax policy. Also, if we look at the pre-treatment period, this tells us something about the parallel trends assumption, and we see statistically insignificant effects across the pre-treatment period, helping us to think that the parallel trends assumption holds in this case. So let's come on to look at economic performance then, looking here at growth and unemployment. And what we see are relatively small changes in the pre- and post-treatment period that fluctuate around zero. Importantly, they're statistically insignificant in the post-treatment period for both growth and unemployment. We do some other variables in the appendix in the paper. And we see also for investment, we see a very similar picture. Where we see the really big effects is in inequality. In terms of economic performance, we don't find any evidence that cutting taxes on the rich boosts economic performance. We cover this a little bit in the paper, but in terms of the sort of existing theory that most aligns with the results that we find in this paper, it will be the work of Piketty et al., which is saying that when we cut taxes on the rich, this increases the incentives of the rich to bargain for their own compensation. So there's a sort of rent-seeking taking place from CEOs and top executives. And that leads the rich to take a bigger share of the pie, but not creating benefits for workers lower down the income distribution. Okay, so I want to come on now to discuss some new work that we've been working on, which really follows on directly from the previous piece of work, where we don't say too much about the mechanisms. We hint at where things fit with previous theories, but we don't test them directly, and so now we're trying to move on to do that. So as I've sort of hinted at just at the end of the previous section, when we have the existing scholarship trying to link top income tax cuts to pre-tax income inequality, this is focused almost exclusively on the individual responses of already affluent individuals to changes in tax rates. So what response do individual rich people have when we change the top rate of income tax, for example? And just to put on the slide what I just said previously, so it's been argued that if we cut top income tax rates, this spurs top executive CEOs to rent seek by bargaining more aggressively for their own compensation. And this sort of assumes this is happening to rich individuals across the economy, across all different sectors. So what we wanted to look at in this new paper was to move beyond this sort of work on individual responses to highlight the potential role that taxation has in shaping the sectoral composition of the economy. And this comes out of the work of our co-author, Lucas Havert, who suggests that general tax policy can be important for shaping how the economy looks, for pushing resources into certain sectors of the economy. Some of his work would show that if you tax consumption more heavily than you tax production, that's beneficial for exporters because it lowers the real exchange rate, and that is in part standing behind some of the export-led growth models that we see in Germany and other places in Europe. So what we're going to be looking at in this paper is another way in which we think top tax rates can influence the sectoral composition of the economy, which is looking at the relationship between top income tax rates and the relative size of the financial sector in the economy. And linking this back to inequality, we think this is very important if we're looking to think about the relationship between taxes on the rich and inequality, because there's this real big literature linking financialization, so the increasing size and importance of the financial sector in the economy, to escalating income inequality. So what's the argument we're putting forward in the paper? Well, the argument that we want to make is that if you cut top income tax rates, that benefits the financial sector disproportionately to other sectors. So the core argument here is based on two key things. So we see that if we cut top income tax rates, it disproportionately benefits the financial sector because, one, they pay unusually high salaries. So there's an awful lot of people working in the financial sector that pay the top income tax rate. And it also employs this internationally mobile labour force. And compensation is a very important part of sort of recruiting and retaining these very mobile, high-skilled workers from this kind of global talent pool. So there's some data from other scholars which is helping to back up some of these two arguments. So firstly, we've got this data on Europe compiled by Denk on the financial sector, which shows that the financial sector is not a massive share of total employment, 4.4% on average. But when we go up the income distribution, when we look at the top 10%, 13% of those wage earners work in the financial sector. If we go up to the top 1%, it gets even higher at 19%. And the top 0.1%, over a quarter of those wage earners are working in the financial sector. So they're very disproportionately represented at the top of the distribution of wage earners. My country, the UK, is no different here. In fact, it's a little bit worse. And so 29% of wage earners in the top 1% in the UK are in the financial sector, and a staggering 44%, nearly half of all wage earners in the top 0.1% are in the financial sector. Of course, a lot of these in the City of London. So this is a very early stage sort of working paper. And so one thing we definitely need to do is get better data when it comes to international mobility, but we're working on that. But there's sort of some of the evidence we do have, and the sort of anecdotal evidence from living and having a lot of friends who work in finance, is that these employees are very internationally mobile, and more so than other high salaried jobs like health or law. And this is just a little quote from The Economist in the late 1980s, saying that London's greatest asset is its pool of talented financiers. Working alongside the locals is a pool of international financiers. So even back in 1988, during the sort of big bang in the financial sector in London, it was already a very internationalized workforce here. And pay is very important, post-tax pay, in terms of keeping this pool of people in London. Okay, so our preliminary empirical analysis then, we've got data for 20 OECD countries from the 70s onwards. Our dependent variable here is the finance and insurance sector as a share of total gross value added, so as a share of the size of the economy. Our main independent variable is top marginal income tax rates. We take that from some of our previous work. And we've got a set of controls here that have been shown in the previous literature to be important in explaining financialization. These sort of left power variables, union density, and the cabinet share of leftist parties, because that's been shown to slow down financialization. The size of social transfers is to get at this idea that sometimes there's a trade-off in countries between credit and the welfare state. And then the last three are just to account for the macroeconomic situation in the country, growth, unemployment, and inflation. So we've got two pieces of analysis in the working paper. The first one is a simple fixed effects panel regression. And the second one is using an approach very similar to the paper I just presented to you. And what we do here is use a threshold of a 4 percentage point drop in the top rate of marginal income tax. Anything that exceeds that is counted as a major reduction in top income tax rates. So I'm just going to present the results from the second part of this, from the match difference in differences estimator, given the time that we have today. So here is another similar looking plot given the previous paper, but this time just looking at top income tax rates of greater than 4 percentage points. Again, these take place across all of the countries in the sample and have a good variation across the years that we look at as well. But again, there's this clustering down the middle of the figure here in the late 1980s and early 1990s, in terms of that being a big period where top income tax rates were cut in a lot of different places. So if we look at Finland here, we see that actually what we're picking up is tax cuts in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, correlating with that figure I showed you earlier. So here's the kind of main results from our preliminary analysis. And so again, we're looking at the point estimates as the black line, the 95% confidence intervals as the grey shaded area. And what we can see here is that if you cut top income tax rates, it increases the size of the financial sector, the relative size, I should say. And then after 3 years, this becomes statistically significant. And by the time we get to 5 years, it's again around 0.7 percentage points as a share of GVA. So to put that into some context, this is equivalent to the increase in the size of the UK financial sector between 2004 and 2006. And that was a time when just before the global financial crisis, when that sector was expanding quite rapidly. So these are quite sizable effects. We see again statistically insignificant effects in the pre-treatment period. And so we think this is at least pointing towards top income tax cuts being related to the growth of the financial sector. And we're trying to move the literature here a little bit beyond thinking about the incentives that are provided by top tax cuts for people with high salaries, to thinking about how if we cut top income tax rates, it can actually shift resources into sectors that pay particularly high salaries. One thing to be very clear about here is this is the relative size of the financial sector. And so other sectors are falling as a percentage of GVA as a result of this expansion of the financial sector. So one of the things we've got to do next in this paper is to look at other sectors and see what the effect of these tax cuts is. And the prime sector we're going to be looking at is manufacturing. We've collected that data, so we just need to analyze it now to see if it actually has a detrimental effect on other sectors when you cut the top rate of income tax in terms of shifting valuable high-skilled resources away from those sectors and towards the financial sector. Okay, so I want to come on now to talk about preferences and a piece of follow-up work we've done with our excellent PhD student Nina Weber from our department. So the motivation for this project, which came sort of directly after our major tax cuts for the rich paper, was in part motivated by the intense and polarized reaction we got to the first paper. We were not really expecting it to take off in the way that it did on social media, which of course was both good and bad. We got a lot of people on the left of the political spectrum, there was a confirmation bias going on. They already knew that trickle-down economics didn't work, and this study was used to sort of support their pre-existing views. On the right of the political spectrum, they just didn't believe the results. They called us that very American of insults, socialists. And, I got more than one very long email from a member of the public in the United States telling me actually how great Reagan's tax cuts were for working Americans. And so there was quite an intense and polarized reaction to what we were doing, and that got us thinking a bit about why it is that some people support tax cuts for the rich. We also found it was puzzling that Some ordinary Americans seem to very strongly support this policy they don't directly benefit from, low and middle income Republicans being the most obvious example. If we look at Trump's tax cuts in 2017, a third of Americans were actually strongly in favor of those tax cuts, even though the majority of Americans thought they would mostly benefit the wealthy and big corporations. And so there's something puzzling going on there. I think against the backdrop of what's been happening in the US to taxes on the rich, to inequality, this is even more surprising. Top marginal income tax rates almost half since 1980, and the top 1% income share doubled over the same period. So inequality was going up really dramatically. So what we do is we want to look at these preferences. We do that for a randomized survey experiment of around 3,000 Americans. We're going to explore their preferences for a specific tax policy change, which is cutting or raising the top rate of federal income tax. We did this survey in May 2021. The paper was just published at the end of last year. So we test in this paper 4 prominent explanations that have been in the economics and political economy literature about what might drive support for taxing the rich. So firstly, we look at unenlightened self-interest, which would suggest that people are generally ignorant about the tax system. They fail to sort of correctly gauge whether they're going to be affected by tax reforms or not. And so they may support tax cuts for the rich under the misapprehension that they'll benefit directly from them. Then we can think about other regarding preferences, that actually whether people think the incomes of the rich were fairly earned is one large driver of their preferences for taxing the rich. If they think they were gained through hard work, they're much more likely to want to tax them less than if they think they were earned through luck or inheritance, for example. Prospect of upward mobility, people's preferences for taxing the rich are not just based on their current income, but they're based on their expectations of future income. So if I think I'm going to be rich in the future, then I may want low taxes on the rich now because I think I'll benefit from them somewhere down the line. And lastly, relating to our first paper, some people may think that if we cut taxes on the rich, there will be positive macroeconomic benefits like employment creation that will indirectly benefit me as someone lower down the income distribution. So this is the experimental design, and I won't go over this in lots of detail given the time we have left, but I'll just give you the key elements of this. So we've got these 3,000 Americans. We did this online. They come into the experiment and they're divided into one of 5 groups. We've got our placebo group on the right-hand side, and then we've got one group for each of our 4 explanations. What we do for, this is an information provision experiment, so we give each group a short piece of text and a column chart, a figure. The placebo is just meant to be something that doesn't affect your tax policy preferences. It's about the length of rivers in the United States. And then for the other 4, we try to have a negative shock that would affect some of their core beliefs in relation to these particular explanations. And I'll show you some of the treatments in a second. So the key thing then, once they've done these treatments, is we ask them about their preferences for cutting and raising the top rate of federal income tax. And we also ask them about some of their beliefs relating to taxing the rich. And then we can compare our placebo group to our treatment groups to see what the effect of the information provided was on both people's preferences and beliefs. So I'll quickly show you what some of the treatments were to give you a better idea of the information that our respondents received. So for unenlightened self-interest, we took the income that they gave us when they started the survey, and then we compared it to the threshold for the top income tax rate in the United States. For everyone in our sample, this showed them that they were not subject to this top rate of tax because we didn't have anyone that had an income over $523,000. Not surprising given the amount they're paid to do these surveys. On the fairness one, we took the Forbes 400 list. We filtered out just those people who inherited their fortune, and we looked at their level of wealth, which is $945 billion. We compared that then to the bottom 50% of the US wealth distribution. 62 million households have the same amount of wealth. And the inherited wealth element of this is important because that's more likely to be seen as a result of luck rather than hard work. So this is meant to pose a negative effect to people's fairness perceptions of the very wealthy. Then we've got our prospect of upward mobility treatment showing respondents that there's a very, very low chance you're going to ever be part of the top 1% during your lifetime, just 2.2% chance versus nearly 98% chance you will not be in that group. And then lastly, our trickle-down treatment, which shows growth from 1980 onwards in the United States was considerably lower than it was in the period after the Second World War. We also, in the accompanying text, tell them that taxes on the rich were considerably lower in the latter period. So at least correlationally, this is showing them that low taxes on the rich are not necessarily associated with high economic growth. So here are some of the main results from the study. And we look at our treatment effects here on the support for cutting and raising the top rate of federal income tax. The tax cut support is shown at the top, the tax increase support at the bottom. These results turn out to be fairly symmetric. There are two treatments that shift people's preferences on what the top federal income tax rate should be. And they're the fairness treatment and the trickle-down treatment, the green and purple lines here. And so we see if we shock these beliefs negatively, they're less likely to want to cut taxes on the rich, and they're more likely to want to increase them. Okay, so some of the key findings that we get from this paper then. There's a lot of results in the paper, so I'm just trying to pull out the key ones for you. So information that shifts people's fairness beliefs, particularly whether the rich are seen as deserving, whether they gain their incomes through hard work, that fundamentally alters preferences for taxing the rich. Now, interestingly, our trickle-down treatment, which we saw from the previous slide, had a big effect on preferences for cutting or raising the top federal income tax rate, actually didn't change people's core beliefs about the macroeconomic benefits of cutting taxes on the rich. I.e. whether they're going to sort of boost the economy by increasing investment and employment creation. So these trickle-down beliefs appear to be really sticky. They're pretty hard to change. And I think this aligns with the reaction to our article. We did not get a lot of people contacting us and saying, you've really changed my mind about this. We've got people on the left saying, I already knew this. We've got people on the right saying the study was rubbish. And so these beliefs appear to be very hard to change. In the US, they seem to very much be along partisan lines. So Democrats tend to not believe in trickle-down, and Republicans are much more likely to. Okay, of course, in terms of getting this paper published, we had to then probe what was actually behind this trickle-down finding. And what we found was that in the text we gave them, where we told them the top rate of federal income tax had fallen from 70% in 1980 down to 37% currently, this was what they took away from the treatment. So they took away that tax on the rich had gone down a lot in the past, and hence they didn't want more tax cuts for the rich, or they felt it should be raised given how much it had fallen. Interestingly enough, the treatment effects we find were particularly large for Republicans, especially on support for tax hikes. And so I think it was between 13 and 17% for the fairness and trickle-down treatments. It really increased a lot the chances they were going to support tax hikes on the rich. And we had a couple of explanations in there that were more based on whether I think I'll directly gain from cutting taxes on the rich. And they didn't seem to be that important in our findings. What was very important were these other regarding preferences, so what people think about the fairness of people who earn lots of money and whether they should be taxed or not. How long is left? Like 15 minutes? 5 minutes. Okay. All right. I'll rattle through. So I wanted to draw out quickly some of the policy implications, I think, from those previous three papers. So there's a lot of countries looking to spur growth. They're also looking to fill the hole in their public finances from the pandemic. And that's a prominent part of debates on taxation in the UK, and I'm sure also here. So what does our research so far have to say about that? Well, I think the most obvious thing is don't cut taxes on the rich to aid the economic recovery from the pandemic, which was a very shortly implemented policy in the UK. what our findings suggest are that that's going to push up inequality after a period where inequality may have been pushed up anyway due to the pandemic, without having these benefits for economic performance that proponents would suggest they would. And from our work on preferences, I think if you're a policymaker, you're looking to build support in the electorate for raising taxes on the rich, then you could take two things from our work. One is to emphasize the past trajectory of taxes on the rich. Now, I may know, and a lot of people in this room, that taxes on the rich in most countries have fallen a lot in the past 30 or 40 years. But the US respondents in our study didn't seem to know that. And so informing the electorate of that helps increase support for taxing the rich. And also providing information that alters people's perceptions of fairness, and specifically fairness related to people earning great amounts of money or about having very high levels of wealth. Now, we found this in the United States. There's also other work by Bastani and Waldenstrom, which does a pretty similar type of thing with wealth taxation in Sweden, and finds if you tell the Swedish electorate about half of the wealth in Sweden coming through inherited wealth, that really affects their support for inheritance taxation. So I think these findings travel beyond just the US context. And if you provide these types of information, at least from our study, it seems particularly effective at increasing support among citizens on the right of the political spectrum for increasing taxes on the rich. Okay, so I'll come on to the last section then, where I just quickly wanted to talk about some of the recent experiences we've had in the UK of taxing the rich, and maybe some lessons that would be useful for Finland. So the first one is this period on the right-hand side here in the blue dotted circle, which is a period after the global financial crisis in the UK. We had a Labour government during the global financial crisis. In April 2009, really at the nadir of the recession following the global financial crisis, they announced the biggest increase in top income tax rates that we've seen in the UK for about 40 years. So they introduced this additional rate on incomes above £150,000, and it was 50%, jumping 10% from the previous highest level. Then we had a Conservative government come in 2010. This policy stayed in place for a couple of years, and then in 2012, they announced it was going to be reduced to 45%. A year later, that took place. So we had this temporary rise in the top marginal rate of income tax that lasted for only 3 years. So the HMRC, about a year into this, published a study, the HMRC being the tax authority in the UK. What was the revenue impact of introducing this 50% rate, which was aiming to make sure, I think, that highly paid bankers and other high-income individuals in the UK sort of paid their fair share of the recovery from the global financial crisis that they partly instigated. So it was forecast to bring in a lot of money, £2.4 billion a year. In fact, it was estimated to have brought in less than £1 billion, and the HMRC, this is their own words, said it was actually quite possible the yield was actually negative, so it actually lost their money introducing this new tax rate. So why did it raise so much less than expected? Well, one of my colleagues at the LSE Inequalities Institute has looked into this, and he argues that the main reason was due to timing effects. So HMRC estimated that between 16 and 18 billion of income was actually brought forward to 2009, 2010. In order to avoid this tax, which was then implemented in the following tax year. Similar thing happened when the tax rate went down, back down to 45%. There was a lot of waiting for income to be declared until the tax rate went down. And so a lot of the affluent managed to avoid the 50% tax on their income. Okay, so I think I've probably already hinted at it, but one of the main lessons we can draw from this episode is don't announce major tax cuts or rises on the rich in advance. These often have very sophisticated advisors helping to minimize their tax bills. If you announce these things in advance, give them time to react, and then the tax is going to raise much less revenue than it otherwise would. And thankfully, the UK government has learned some lessons on this. So in 2020, in March, they increased capital gains tax in the UK, and they announced that in the budget, and it came in with immediate effect. Now, some industry groups were unhappy about that, the lack of consultation, but certainly in terms of its revenue-raising ability, it made the tax much harder to avoid by shifting income around in time. Okay, so a couple of very brief things, and then I'll tie up. So this one is about whether the UK are paying their fair share of, or the rich are paying their fair share of taxes. So it's often argued as a reason in the UK for not taxing the rich more that their top 1% pay 30% of all income tax in the country. And so they pay a large proportion of income tax, well out of proportion to their number. But I think that's not the whole story. And again, some work by Advani and Summers, a couple of my colleagues, would suggest that was the case. So what we're seeing here are effective average tax rates on income and total remuneration for very rich individuals with income of over £100,000. We've got millions on the x-axis down here. So these are some very rich individuals as we move to the right in the figure. What we can take away from this is that the effective rate that they pay on their income and on their total remuneration is considerably less than the headline rate of income tax. And that gap gets larger the further right we move in the figure. And so there are some very rich individuals paying a lot less than the headline rate. So part of what's driving this is the big variation in how much tax people are paying. So if you're a very high wage earner and you're paid by a firm, you'll be paying very close to the headline rate of income tax. If your income is more in capital gains, if it's more in investment income, those are taxed at lower rates, and you can pay a much lower tax rate on your total remuneration. And this rate that some rich people pay is the same or lower than people much lower down the income distribution. So there is an argument that that is unfair. One of the solutions that's proposed by these authors is that we introduce sort of alternative minimum tax, where people with incomes above 100,000 have to pay a minimum rate of, say, 35% on their taxable income and gains. And that would help avoid this situation where you have some very rich individuals paying tax rates that are considerably lower than the average person. Lastly, then, I just wanted to point you towards this very interesting piece of work by the Wealth Tax Commission in the United Kingdom, again made up from some colleagues of mine. And they look at the possibility of implementing a wealth tax in the UK. They look at both a one-off wealth tax that will be a sort of 1% tax on wealth for 5 years, very specifically to rebuild the public finances after the pandemic. They also look at the possibility of an annual wealth tax being introduced. They show this is quite a politically popular thing in the UK. And also they look at how much revenue it would raise, how you could design it. Also, they try to allay some fears people would have about, say, this particularly costing middle-class homeowners, and they show how that wouldn't be the case. And so I thought this may be interesting for you for the Finnish debate, but also I think it shows that wealth taxes are really back on the agenda in a way that they haven't been previously. I mean, I hadn't heard them talked about in the UK really at all, and then this report was published. Rishi Sunak, who's now our Prime Minister, was, I think, then the Chancellor, and he felt the need to come out and say he was against a wealth tax. But that's a real step change in politics, because previous to that, there just was no discussion at all of wealth taxes. So this could be something to consider in the Finnish case as well. So just to conclude then, and hopefully I'm not too over time, really what our research is doing, this broad agenda, is to look at the political economic causes and consequences of taxing the rich.
Knowledge helps.
I think it does provide strong evidence against this influential political economic idea that tax cuts for the rich trickle down to boost the wider economy. From some of the preliminary evidence I presented in the middle part of the presentation, I think we can see that top income tax rates, they don't just benefit the top 1%, but also the sectors in which the top 1% work, primarily in the financial sector. And the experimental work we've done on preferences, I think, suggests that providing voters with the right type of information can increase their support for raising taxes on the rich. And we find that's the case for even for people on the right of the political spectrum who are not normally in favour of this type of policy. And hopefully, briefly touching on some recent research on taxing the rich in the UK can provide some lessons for other countries, as well as potentially some policy proposals that could be considered as well. Okay, thanks very much for your attention. I've got my email and personal website there if you want to look at more of my research or contact me at all. And I'll be around in the lunch break as well today if anyone wants to come up and have a chat. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
So right information helps, and we should all work in a financial sector. That was one of the key findings I find. So, but now it's time for the questions. Who wants to start? There one. So a microphone, and please tell your name too.
Yes, hello, I'm Kaisa Kotakorpi, Professor of Economics at Tampere University. Thanks, David, for a very interesting talk. I was wondering about the results on the effects of tax cuts on the rich. So as you mentioned, there was a trend of declining taxes in basically all of the countries that you studied. So it's not really that you're comparing effects of major tax cuts to, no tax cuts. It's rather you're comparing effects of major tax cuts to smaller tax cuts. So would you say that this is kind of a lower bound of effects of tax cuts? So how would you interpret the results, given the comparison that you make in the analysis?
Yeah, that's well. I mean, we try to match on the pre-treatment trajectories of tax cuts for the rich, and also on covariates. So we try to match as much as possible to make the control and treatment very similar. I think. So we also do it for one standard deviation, which picks up a lot of the smaller tax cuts for the rich as well. And the results are very similar in terms substantively. You see this big increase in inequality, and you see not much effect on economic performance. But the effects are smaller for if you take the threshold down, because then you're picking up smaller tax cuts for the rich, and they have an effect on inequality, but not the same size as those 30 really major tax cuts that we look at in the main part of the paper.
Next one, there, on the other side.
Hello, I'm Saska Heiner from the University of Helsinki. Thank you for first and foremost. Secondly, a question on this index of yours in the first paper. You have quite a few variables in it. So how sensitive is it to the choice of variables or the weights you use in building it? So when you have, for instance, the top statutory rates and effective rates, etc. So how sensitive is the index to these results? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these variables move in a similar pattern over time, and so if you can choose how many dimensions, or you can at least test it if, say, there are two sort of dimensions that move together, or if there's one or more. And we found that it was very much one from the analysis that we did. So these things were moving pretty much in step with one another. And I don't think the measure overall was that sensitive to removing individual measures. I'm sure there's something probably in the appendix on the paper about that. And so, yeah, I think it's pretty robust in the fact that these things tended to move together.
There, yeah. Yeah. She was first. Yeah.
Thank you very much for very good presentations. Very interesting. I'm Kaisa Vatanen. I'm head of policy for the Social Democratic Party here in Finland. So my question is perhaps slightly less academic, although the academic part was very interesting. But you mentioned about the reaction that you got to these very kind of politically contentious issues. Yeah. And I was wondering, you mentioned about the kind of public reaction, but you also slightly touched at the end on the wealth tax about the Rishi Sunak's reaction. On your opinion, and this is purely opinion-based, I'm not expecting an academic answer, there has been the decline of the wealth tax or the taxes on wealth on all of the countries across the Western Europe, regardless, based on the data, regardless of the color of the government, so to speak. You said that there are some influence on the number of the left kind of leaning governments on there, but you are providing data that is factual, yet the kind of debate you said that is very unlikely to change. How do you think that it has any effect? The data that you're providing, does it have any effect on the policy making?
Sorry, so do you mean the data from the middle?
Yeah, the kind of results that you're showing that there's been a massive have an effect on the politicians?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think also in the time we're at after the pandemic, it does feel to me a little bit different in UK tax policy making to perhaps how it was previously. I mean, we've got now Rishi Sunak introducing quite a large increase in corporation tax. It's going from 19% up to 25%, I think, after a sort of 10-year period where the Conservative government he's part of were reducing it heavily. And part of his justification was that it doesn't seem, looking at the data, to have increased investment much, which was always the argument for doing it. But I don't know if that policy space has kind of opened up a little bit since the pandemic, because of the UK government ploughed hundreds of billions of pounds into the health system and also into the furlough scheme. That's meant they need to raise revenue. And with the sort of general public, sometimes these taxes that are sort of less broad-based and hit people higher up the income distribution more are sort of more popular, as you would imagine, to raise for the average person in the UK. And so the fact we've got a centre-right government talking about these issues, I think there has been a bit of a difference, both due to the pandemic and also due to the sort of long period of inequality that we've had before that.
Yeah. And then Timo Viherkenttä was the next one.
Yeah. Thank you. Very interesting. Timo Viherkenttä, Senior Fellow, Aalto University. You include different taxes in your analysis, such as the highest marginal tax rates, corporation tax that you were just referring to, inheritance taxes and all that. Would you have any observations on the relative roles and significance of the different taxes in your analysis? Do they play a different role on the overall results?
Yeah, good question. So I think, well, to give you any real specifics, I think I would have to go back and look at the underlying data. From the sort of, I've obviously looked a bit into the underlying data for Finland for this presentation, and I think what drives the big changes that we saw in the Finnish index was really the big changes in top marginal income tax rates and corporation tax rates. So I think because the tax rates are subject to large drops at certain points in time, whereas some of the effective sort of tax rates change, but not as dramatically, I think the rates are the ones which really cause the big drops in the index. So that's where I think some of those big changes are coming in.
Okay. And one more question. Yeah, you were there. Yeah,
there was someone up there. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
One more. Yeah.
Super interesting presentation. I'm Janne Korhonen. I'm from the Sorsa Foundation. Just started on just and sustainable transition. What kind of evidence or arguments there are against these conclusions of yours, and how strong arguments or evidence do you think they are?
So in terms of the economic consequences of cutting taxes on the rich? So, I mean, I think, of course, if you release a paper like this and it gets a lot of attention, there are a lot of economists reading it and, talking about our methodology, and, that's always the case as well when you get these papers reviewed. I mean, I think there's sort of evidence we have is that, some other papers do say that if you increase tax on the rich, it's bad for growth. And so there's some evidence out there that takes a different empirical approach that comes to a different result. But I think from pointing out the weaknesses I did in those studies, I think given we've got a much larger study in terms of the countries that are covered, in terms of the amount of tax cuts we cover, I'm sort of more confident that ours is closer to the answer. And also we try to take steps to, as much as possible, identify causal effects. Given the data we have, that's very difficult. But I think we take all the steps that's possible to take to try and achieve that.
And there's time for one more question.
Okay, thank you so much that you had time. I'm Anni Huhtala from Finnish Economic Policy Council, and I'm just curious about this mechanism. I have a hard time understand that why this tax cuts would kind of lead to rent-seeking behavior by these top executives, so that it's where does it come from, this hypothesis? And because from psychological point of view or anything, it's kind of contradictory in a sense because they are getting more. So how come they then become more aggressive?
Yeah, I think the argument for that is that of any given increase in money they get to keep more of it. And so when the top marginal income tax rate is, say, 70%, it's not really worth you pushing to get much higher compensation because you don't see much of it. Whereas when the tax rate is much lower and you get to keep a lot more of it, then there seems to be this incentive to try and inflate your income as much as possible. And so that was sort of Piketty found that lined up pretty well as well with the data from the OECD countries, and our results sort of support the theoretical channel he proposes there. And so I think that's the argument, yeah.
Okay, so thank you, David. So I'm sure that there is lots of things that we would like to discuss maybe with David also about how is it possible that conservatives can make tax reforms that fall on rich so easily in one-party system in Britain, why it seems to be so difficult here in Finland. But David has promised to be here during the lunchtime so that you can mingle and share your thoughts with each another, and please do that. He's ready for that. But now we will continue and we will change the language in Finnish. But first, let's give a big hand for David one more time. Thank you, David.